Hey folks, and welcome back and welcome to lesson 5 of my restorative gardening program here. And today we are all focused on how to go about building trellis structures in the garden so that our plant babies can grow vertically and really be set up to absolutely thrive for this upcoming season. Now, if this is the first lesson that you're joining in on, my name is Jordan. I run a company called Mind and Soil where I'm looking to introduce 1 million individuals to gardening's mental health benefits. So my hope is that all the tips and the techniques and the trellis structures that we go through today help you in ultimately getting your hands dirty out in the garden so that you can experience just how peaceful, calming, and restorative the garden is. So now with that being said, I want to go ahead and start diving straight into this lesson. And if we were to backtrack just a little bit, the last thing that we did in lesson number 4 was hardening off and transplanting our seedlings, our plant babies, into the garden. And by going through that process so methodically, they are all set and all set up to go through a huge growth spurt now that their light source is the sun and getting all of that light from the sun there. Now, as they go through that growth spurt, some of the plants like arugula or radishes and basil are going to stay fairly small, and we don't need to do any trellising for them. But other plants such as tomatoes, cucumbers, squashes, these are going to absolutely take off, and really, if we don't trellis them, they're going to end up eating up a lot of our precious gardening real estate. However, if we do get them onto a trellis, we're really setting them up to be in a way better environment for the whole season ahead. So to bring that to life, what I'm going to do is walk us through how to build a tomato trellis, how to build a squash trellis, and then at the very end, we're going to go through how to go about building a cucumber trellis. And so to begin diving in, the first trellis that we're going to go about building is the tomato trellis. And the first thing that we need to know on this front is whether or not we're growing a determinate variety of tomato or an indeterminate variety of a tomato. And it's really easy to find this out when you either buy your seedling or you're starting your seeds from scratch. Just look on the back of the seed pack, and in the description it will describe whether or not this is a determinate variety or an indeterminate variety. The determinate varieties, they grow for a specific number of days, and then they're not going to put out any more vertical growth after that. And because of that, trellising these determinate tomatoes is really easy. All that we need to do is essentially use something like a tomato cage that's not going to go any higher than 3 or 4 feet in height. And so once you've popped that onto your determinate tomato, that's really all that you need to be doing, because again, it's going to only grow for a determined number of days and stay fairly short to the ground. Now, on the other hand, indeterminate tomatoes, these are the ones that we want to have a much larger trellis in place for. And they're called indeterminate tomatoes because they're going to keep on growing and growing as a vine, so really far in length, until the weather or the conditions are no longer favorable. So if you're living in a really warm climate, these babies are going to just keep on growing until they die off, either due to a disease or due to a cold snap, something along those lines. And as they put out all of that growth, it's in the form of a vine. So it's not uncommon for a tomato plant to end up 7, 8, 9, 10 feet in height in terms of the overall vine length there. So let's start diving into the type of trellis that we're going to build for these indeterminate varieties. So for this new bed that I just put into my backyard, I'm going to be growing tomatoes at the very back of the bed. And so what I want to do is ultimately set up an archway trellis at the very back there for them to be growing vertically up along a string. And so the first thing that I'm going to do here is measure the inside of the bed, because that's how wide the archway is going to be. And then I'm going to cut a piece of wood to that length, and I'm going to be using 2x4s for this, so it's nice and sturdy. And so with my width piece cut, I'm now going to connect that to 2 8-foot 2x4s. And this is what's effectively going to create that archway for our trellises to grow up along the string. And so to do this, all that I'm going to do is put 2 screws into the 2x4 that's going widthwise to connect it to the 8-foot long 2x4s. And then on the inside, I'm going to use an L bracket just to add a little bit more stability and strength to the structure. Now for this specific trellis, I want it to be sitting 6.5 feet above the bed so that there's a lot of space for the tomatoes to be growing up vertically towards. And because of that, the remainder is going to be buried in the bed. So what I'm going to do is make a tick mark on the 8-foot long 2x4s at the 78-inch mark. And all of that, those 78 inches are going to be above the ground, and that little tick mark is going to be my indicator for where it should be entering into the raised bed. And so with those pieces connected, I can now go about taking this out into the garden to begin putting it in to the raised bed that I have just established. And to make it nice and even on both sides, I'm going to put a little tick mark at the 6-inch mark on the bed, and that's lengthwise, so it's going to be sitting 6 inches away from the back end of the bed there. And with that in place, I'm then going to dig up a whole bunch of the soil so that we can again slide this trellis structure into the bed here. And again, once I've popped the trellis in here and backfilled with the soil, that's going to add even more security and stability to it. Plus, it's going to just look really nice and flush and sleek in the garden as I have it set up this way, and kind of hiding the wood in the garden bed itself there. And so now with those holes dug, I'm all set to begin moving this trellis structure into the garden bed. So I'm simply going to pick it up, pull it over, and then all that I'm doing is trying to line up the tick marks. Again, I'm trying to match the 6-inch tick mark on the garden bed that I put, so it's 6 inches from the back, with the 78-inch mark, so that 6.5 feet of the trellis are sitting above the surface. Now, once I've lined that up on both sides, and then once I have that all lined up, I'm just going to take my level and put that on the very top, just to make sure that everything is nice and level and looking really solid there. And so with that all leveled and ready to go, the last thing that I need to do is simply connect it to the raised bed. And to do that, all that I need to do is simply drop 3 screws into each side that is going beneath the surface. So I'm connecting the trellis with these 3 screws on each side to the raised bed itself, so it kind of becomes one complete unit there. And now with the trellis secured to the raised bed, all that I need to do now is backfill that soil into the area that I had just dug it up from, and that is also going to help secure the trellis, give it less ability to move around, anything along those lines. Perfect, so we have our trellis now into the garden, but we need something for our plant baby to climb up and for us to weave it through in order for it to know how to grow vertically. So what we're going to do is we're first going to transplant our tomatoes into the garden. And so you're going to dig a little transplant hole, and in the bottom of that hole, I encourage you to put 1 handful of worm castings and then 1 tablespoon of an organic fertilizer. Gently massage that into the transplant hole so there's tons of nutrients and microbial life for our plant baby. And then you're going to take your tomato and you're going to take it out of the seed cell, loosen, kind of massage the roots so that they're ready to grow into all of the new soil that they're going to have now, and backfill with the surrounding soil in that bed. After that point, you can then use 1 more handful of worm castings and 1 tablespoon of organic fertilizer around the base of the plant, and it is all set up from a soil perspective. So the last thing that we need to do is we need to connect it to the trellis using a piece of yarn. You're going to notice over the course of this video here that I use a lot of yarn when it comes to trellising. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to tie this piece of yarn around the bottom of my tomato plant. And I don't want to do it too tightly because that stem is going to get larger as the plant grows, but I also don't want it super loose. And then once I've tied the bottom, I'm going to run that vertically all the way up and over the trellis. So essentially there is a long line of yarn that the tomato can now begin to grow up. And I'm just going to tie that off on the top side so that it is connected and secured to the trellis. Now with the yarn running from the bottom of the tomato plant all the way up to the top of the trellis, the last thing that you're going to do here is weave the tomato plant through that yarn, and you're going to do this over the course of the season as the plant continues to grow. So this isn't something that you do just once, but rather as it puts on its next 6 inches of growth, its next 12 inches of growth, you're going to continue just to weave it through that one string, and that's going to keep the plant growing nice and vertically up the trellis that we've put in place. And I guarantee you that in no time, with the way that we've transplanted it and trellised it, it is going to be absolutely full of life and full of beautiful tomatoes for you to be enjoying all through the season here. So that is our first trellis structure for this lesson. Now the next one that I want to move into is the squash trellis and how to go about building a squash trellis here. And there's a couple of reasons why we want to be trellising our squash. The first one is that these plants, they just take up so much space. So squash, they are these vines that are just going to grow at an incredibly fast pace. And on top of that, they have these huge leaves that within just a few weeks, they could completely overtake a full garden bed and shade out any plants that would be growing on the surface there. But if we trellis them vertically, these vines, they love to find things to hang on to and just keep on going in that direction that they have been trained. And the second key reason that this works really great for squash is because it ultimately allows us to get that squash fruit off of the ground as it begins to ripen and just kind of hanging in the air. And this is really great for two reasons. One, it decreases the likelihood of it sitting in moisture and ultimately getting moldy. And two, it also makes it much more difficult for any insects or pests that are living down on the kind of soil level to be getting to that plant. It's going to be much safer when it's just hanging up in the air there. So getting it trellised is going to allow you to save a ton of space and probably also allow you to enjoy way more of the squash coming off of the plant. And this one is also a really easy trellis to build. Essentially, we're building an oversized ladder. So all that we need for this one to get started is 3 8-foot 2x2s. So you don't even need for these to be 2x4s. 2x2s is totally fine. And what you're going to do is you're going to put a tick mark every 20 inches on these pieces of wood. And then just line them up so that you've got those same kind of 20-inch intervals on each of the 3 8-foot pieces of 2x2. Now, once you've ticked them, what you're going to want to do is lay them down on your grass or somewhere where you're able to assemble it and kind of space them out evenly. And what we're going to do next is we're going to attach cross braces to these three so that, again, is a bit of an oversized ladder. And the length of these cross braces is going to vary for each of us depending on the width of the bed that we're planting into. So for myself, I'm planting my squash into a raised bed that's about 8 feet by 8 feet. Therefore, the inside of this bed is about 7 feet and 6 inches. So my cross braces are 7 feet and 6 inches, and that's going to allow me to slide this trellis directly into the bed and have it nice and flush along the outside of that bed there. And so with my 7-foot 6 inch cross braces, all that I do now is I start connecting them to the 3 pieces of wood that we have for our trellis at those 20-inch intervals. So I find the tick mark, I line up my cross brace, and then I'm just dropping screws into that 2x2 and cross brace so that it's nice and secured onto it. And so as I connect these, again, keep in mind that for me, that is 7 feet and 6 inches, but for you, it might be even smaller than that if you aren't growing in a bed as large as a 8-foot by 8-foot bed. Maybe it's only a 4-foot by 8-foot bed that you're growing in which case you might only need 2 of the original 8-foot pieces of wood. So again, just kind of understand the principles of this structure, and then you're going to be able to easily morph it for your growing environment. And so now with the majority of the trellis established, the cross braces in place, I'm going to now bring it over to the area that I am planting into, and I'm just going to slide that into the bed there, get it nice and set in place before doing the final little assembly here. And that final assembly piece that we're going to do is once again coming back to the yarn. So what I'm going to do is take yarn and simply run it from one of the 8-foot pieces of length over to the middle one, around that, and all the way over to the far side. And then I'm just gonna keep on looping back and forth like this every 3 to 4 inches. And so what that means is that there's basically now like these yarn strips every 3 to 4 inches on my trellis. And this is really great for squash because as they grow, they have these little things called tendrils. And these tendrils are what are ultimately going to go out, find something to hold on to, wrap around to, and allow the main stem to grow further vertically. So once you've put yarn all through your squash trellis here, the last thing that you want to do is transplant in your squash babies and then begin to train them up the trellis. So at the very beginning, all that you need to do is just basically grab that main stem and kind of weave it through the trellis here. And what you'll notice over the following days is that those tendrils, they're going to shoot out and they're going to find that piece of yarn for it to begin growing vertically. And you might need to do this a couple of times just to get it the first kind of like 10 inches, 12 inches, 18 inches up the trellis. And then after that point, it's gonna kind of realize, okay, there's opportunity here to grow vertically. I'm gonna keep on going in that direction. And one thing that I'll add in here is that if you are growing in a container or a grow bag, you can do the exact same thing here. You're essentially just scaling it down in terms of width for the grow bag or container that you're growing in. So in this particular instance, I've effectively just put a ladder together with, again, 2 8-foot tall pieces of 2x2 and then connected with cross braces that are just wider than the grow bag itself. And then once I have that in place, I'm once again just running yarn between each of those cross braces, so there's a piece of yarn every 3 to 4 inches for it to be holding onto. And then I'd once again just train this plant out over the course of the first few weeks so that it knows to grow vertically. And so it'll probably look fairly tiny at the very beginning, but folks, believe me that once these plants are onto this trellis structure and as we get into those warm, hot days of summer, squash plants absolutely take off and they're going to be sprinting up that trellis, probably reaching the top of it before you know it. And what's really cool about this structure and this setup is that all of the fruit, they're going to be hanging beneath the trellis, so you can just quickly kind of squeeze underneath it, grab the fruit, harvest those off, and then allow the plant to continue to grow vertically. And as a matter of fact, this trellis structure is exactly what I use for my peas as well. So all the snap peas that I grow, I just have them run up a vertical trellis like this, and I can put about like 40 to 50 peas at the bottom there, which ends up giving me a really beautiful harvest. And so before we wrap up here, folks, we still have our third and final trellis to go through. It's one of my absolute favorites, and that is the A-frame cucumber trellis. And now there's really two big reasons why we want to be trellising our cucumbers. One of them is the same theme that we've been touching on so far, which is that we want to be growing them vertically to maximize our space and our real estate in the garden. Cucumbers, they're in the same family as squash, and so they're going to grow super long lengthwise as a vine with big leaves and take up tons of real estate, which could be ultimately dedicated towards other plants. But if we grow them vertically, then we've solved the problem. Now, the second piece is that cucumbers, they put out all kinds of suckers, similar to tomatoes, and these suckers, as they expand and grow, are going to produce flowers and produce more fruit as well. So having them on an A-frame like this kind of allows them to grow every which direction in this kind of confined area. And so for myself, I now grow about 6 cucumber plants, and that's all on an A-frame trellis, and I end up harvesting well over 100 cucumbers every season because they are just so prolific as they begin to put out those suckers and all the flowers associated with it. So this structure really, really great for ultimately increasing your harvest, your yield of cucumbers. And so to do so, we're going to need 2 8-foot long 2x2s. So once again, we're not using 2x4s here. And the first thing that we're going to do is cut them in half so that we end up having 4 4-foot long 2x2s. And this is what we're going to use for the A-frame itself. And so this next part is a little bit tricky, but I have a feeling that it'll be fairly straightforward for you. All that you're going to do is you want to make a tick mark 9 inches down one of the legs. So you measure down 9 inches, you make a tick mark. And now what you want to do is you want to draw a diagonal line from the end of that piece of wood to the tick mark. And what we're going to do is we're going to now cut along that line so that ultimately we can have it flush and begin to create that A-frame. And then you're going to repeat this process with the other 3 pieces of wood. And what this allows, again, is for us to now be connecting each of those diagonal cuts so that it's nice and flush to begin creating that A-frame structure. And so now with it cut down and matched to one of the other 4 pieces of wood that we also cut down, all that we need to do is connect it by a couple of screws. So you're going to drop 2 to 3 screws into the top of this A-frame structure so that it's nice and secured at the top there. And then you repeat this process with your other 2 pieces of wood that you've also cut down to 4 inches and done the 9-inch diagonal cut with. And that leaves us with the 2 ends of our A-frame that now need to be connected with cross braces. And so once again, the length of our cross braces is going to vary or depend based on our gardening environment. For myself, I'm going to place mine into my backyard here in this back area, and that area is about 5 feet in length. So my cross braces, I'm going to make those 5 feet in length. and I quickly cut those. And then it's just simply a matter of connecting those to the A-frame in the exact same way that we did with our squash trellis. And you could do these cross braces at 20 inches, just like the squash trellis, or you could do them at 16 inches. Feel free to play around with this based on what you ultimately like, especially now that you're getting a little bit comfortable and a little bit familiar with how trellis structures work. And so once you've connected the cross braces on both sides of the A-frame here, voila, it is all set and ready to be moved into the garden. So I'm just going to bring this into my backyard here and put it into that area that I showed you just a minute ago, where ultimately I'm going to be able to be growing my cucumbers. And as you can probably guess, at this point, there's only one thing left that we need to be doing with this structure, and that is adding our yarn onto it. So exact same as the squash trellis here, what I'm going to be doing is basically starting at the very bottom, connecting it to one side, and then running that yarn all the way to the other side of the A-frame trellis. And then I'm just gonna go up about 3 to 4 inches before coming all the way back across. And I'm gonna continue doing this all the way up to the very top of the A-frame on the front and on the back, because we're going to plant cucumbers on both sides of this trellis. And so with the yarn all connected, what I like to do is then plant about 6 cucumber plants on this trellis. 3 on the back side and 3 on the front side, because what begins to happen is that the cucumber grows up vertically through this trellis structure using its tendrils just as the squash did, and then it puts out all of its suckers and they start running every which direction and their tendrils begin to connect. And so ultimately it kind of turns into this little like cucumber factory where there's just endless numbers of cucumbers that you're going to have and be able to harvest off of this plant all through the summer season here. And that's really how simple it is to ultimately be building out our structures. And to be honest with you, as you go down your gardening journey and your gardening path, what you can do is you can begin to play around with these trellis structures. You know, these are really good kind of like starting points, but absolutely feel free to play around and make some adjustments or some tweaks to them based on your growing environment, as well as all of your learnings as you grow plants on trellises. So again, use this as your starting point, but then don't be afraid to vary away from it, because there is not any right way to go about gardening and any wrong way to go about gardening, but rather just different approaches based off of all of our personal preferences. And so where do we go from here? We know we've got the garden now all set up, ready to grow. The very last lesson that we have in this program here is a complete from seed all the way to harvest guide on one of my absolute favorite crops, which is garlic. So in the next and final episode, I'm going to show you how to grow absolutely amazing garlic. So when you're all set, feel free to head over there. Until then, go get your hands dirty, and I can't wait to catch you on that lesson. See you soon.